The telegram from her sister arrived on the morning Delilah Gregory turned 32, informing her that yet another cousin had gotten married, making her the last unwed woman in her entire extended family. She stood behind the counter of her modest general store in Gila Bend, Arizona Territory, in the sweltering August heat of 1883, and felt the walls of her carefully constructed life press closer around her heart. The store had been her father's before consumption took him 3 years back, and her mother's before a riding accident claimed her when Delilah was only 19. For 13 years, she had run this place alone, ordering supplies, keeping ledgers, serving the miners and ranchers and drifters who passed through this sun-scorched town, where the Gila River bent like a horseshoe through the desert. She had convinced herself that independence was enough, that the companionship of customers and the satisfaction of a profitable business could fill the hollow spaces in her chest. She was wrong. Delilah folded the telegram carefully and tucked it beneath the cash box, then smoothed her hands over her dark blue calico dress. At 32, she still had the same auburn hair she'd worn in braids as a girl, though now she pinned it in a sensible bun at the nape of her neck. Her face had weathered some in the Arizona sun, fine lines appearing at the corners of her green eyes, but she knew she wasn't unattractive. Men had courted her over the years. She had simply never felt that spark her mother had told her about before she died, that feeling of coming home to someone who made the world make sense. By the time she was 25, she had stopped hoping. By 30, she had stopped looking. And now, at 32, she had resigned herself to a life measured in inventory and profit margins, in quiet evenings reading by lamplight, in conversations that never went deeper than the weather or the price of flour. The bell above her door chimed, and she looked up to see old Samuel Morrison shuffling in for his weekly tobacco. She greeted him with practiced cheerfulness, made the sale, and watched him leave. Through the window, she could see the dusty main street of Gila Bend, the handful of buildings that comprised the town's commercial district, the desert stretching endlessly beyond. This was her world, and it felt smaller every day. She was restocking shelves when the bell chimed again. This time she heard multiple footsteps and the jingle of spurs. When she turned, she saw 3 men she recognized as ranch hands from the sprawling Patterson spread about 15 miles north of town. They bought supplies regularly, usually sent in by the foreman, but these 3 had troublemaker written all over them. She'd seen their type before, young men with too much energy and too little sense, looking for entertainment in a town that offered precious little. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she said, keeping her voice level and professional. "What can I help you with today?" The tallest one, a man with a patchy beard and mean eyes, grinned at her. "We need some coffee, sugar, and whatever else strikes our fancy, Miss Gregory." She nodded and began gathering their items, aware of them spreading out through the store, picking things up and putting them down with more force than necessary. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her movement steady. She had dealt with difficult customers before. Usually they got bored and left. "That will be $4.60, she said when she had tallied their goods. The tall one laughed. "Now that seems a mite high, doesn't it, boys?" His companions agreed with exaggerated nods. Delilah felt her stomach tighten. "That's the standard price." "You can check the list posted on the wall. Maybe we think you should give us a discount," the tall one said, leaning against the counter, "for being such loyal customers and all." "The prices are fixed," Delilah said firmly. $4.60. What happened next happened fast. The tall one reached across the counter and grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to hurt but firm enough to frighten. "Now, you listen here. "Lady," the bell above the door chimed again, and a voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "I believe the lady asked you to pay and leave." All heads turned. Delilah's gaze landed on a man she had never seen before, standing just inside the doorway. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders beneath a dusty brown shirt and vest. His hat was pushed back just enough to reveal dark hair and eyes that were currently fixed on the ranch hands with an intensity that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster worn smooth from use. "This ain't your business, stranger," the tall ranch hand said, releasing Delilah's wrist. "I'm making it my business," the stranger said calmly. He hadn't moved from his position by the door, hadn't touched his gun, but something in his bearing suggested he wouldn't need to. "Pay the lady what you owe her and move along." The 3 ranch hands exchanged glances, calculating odds. Whatever conclusion they reached, it ended with the tall one tossing a handful of coins on the counter with more force than necessary. "Keep the change," he sneered, though the amount was short by almost $1. The stranger stepped aside to let them pass, his gaze never leaving them until they had mounted their horses outside and ridden off in a cloud of dust. Only then did he turn his full attention to Delilah, and she felt her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Are you all right, madam?" he asked, and his voice was different now, gentler, with a slight drawl that suggested Texas origins. "I'm fine," Delilah said, though her hands were shaking as she gathered the scattered coins. "Thank you for intervening. That was very kind of you." "Nothing kind about it," he said, moving closer to the counter. "Just the right thing to do." He picked up a coin that had rolled to the edge and placed it in her palm, his calloused fingers brushing hers for just a moment. "They shorted you." "I know," Delilah admitted, "but it's not worth the trouble." He studied her for a moment, and she found herself studying him back. He was younger than she had first thought, probably in his early 30s, with a face that was more interesting than handsome, weathered by sun and wind but kind around the eyes. There was a small scar on his chin and another above his left eyebrow. He had the look of a man who had seen trouble but hadn't let it make him cruel. "I'm Kyle Patterson," he said, removing his hat. "I just inherited the Patterson ranch, apparently along with some hands who need better supervision. I apologize for their behavior." Delilah felt her cheeks warm. The Patterson ranch was one of the largest in the territory, sprawling across thousands of acres of desert and scrubland, running cattle and horses. Old Marcus Patterson had died last spring, and word had gone around that he had a nephew back in Texas who would inherit, but no one had seen the man until now. "Delilah Gregory," she said, extending her hand. "I own this store, and you don't need to apologize for them. They're grown men responsible for their own actions." Kyle shook her hand, his grip firm but careful. "True enough, but they're on my payroll, which makes them my responsibility. I'll make sure they pay you what they owe, plus something extra for the trouble." "That's not necessary," Delilah protested. "Maybe not, but I'll do it anyway," Kyle said. He glanced around the store, taking in the neat shelves, the carefully organized inventory, the ledgers stacked on the desk in the corner. "You run this place yourself?" "For the past 3 years since my father passed," Delilah said. "Before that, I helped him run it." "That's impressive," Kyle said, and something in his tone told her he meant it. "It's not easy keeping a business going out here." "It has its challenges," Delilah admitted, "but I manage." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, and Delilah found herself not wanting him to leave. There was something about him, something steady and real, that made her feel more present in her own skin than she had in years. "I imagine you'll be needing supplies for the ranch," she said finally, falling back on business because it was safe, familiar territory. I can prepare a list of what I have in stock, prices, and quantities. Your uncle used to order monthly. That would be helpful, Kyle said. Though I should tell you up front, I'm still getting a handle on what the ranch needs. I've been working cattle most of my life, but always for other people. This is my first time running my own operation. Your uncle built a good foundation, Delilah said. The Patterson Ranch has a solid reputation. Had, Kyle corrected quietly. I aim to maintain it, but I know there are folks wondering if some Texas drifter can fill Marcus Patterson's boots. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, just stating a truth. Then you'll have to show them, Delilah said. That's what I did when my father died. Half the town thought a woman couldn't run a business on her own. I proved them wrong one sale at a time. Kyle smiled at that, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger. I suspect you proved them very wrong, Miss Gregory. Delilah, please, she said. We're not formal in Gila Bend. Delilah, he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his voice. Then you should call me Kyle. He ended up staying for nearly an hour, ostensibly to discuss supply needs, but really just talking. Delilah learned that he was 33, that he had been working ranches in Texas since he was 14, that his mother was Marcus Patterson's younger sister and had died when Kyle was just a boy. He had never met his uncle in person, only through occasional letters, so the inheritance had come as a complete surprise. Why ranching? Delilah asked at one point, genuinely curious. If you've been doing it since you were 14, that's almost 20 years. Most men would have moved on to something else by now. Kyle leaned against the counter, considering the question seriously. I like the work, he said finally. I like being outside, working with animals, seeing the results of hard effort. And I like the idea that you're building something, you know. Every calf that makes it through the winter, every fence you mend, every acre you improve, it all adds up to something real and lasting. Delilah understood that better than he could know. It was exactly how she felt about her store, about the careful work of maintaining inventory and relationships, of being a reliable presence in an unreliable world. I should let you get back to work, Kyle said eventually, straightening up and settling his hat back on his head. But I'll be back tomorrow with that payment and to place a proper order. I'll have a list ready, Delilah promised. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. It was a pleasure meeting you, Delilah, a real pleasure. Likewise, she said, and meant it more than she had meant anything in a long time. After he left, Delilah stood behind her counter in the quiet store and felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It took her a moment to identify it, and when she did, she almost laughed at herself. Hope. After all these years of resignation, of convincing herself that love had passed her by, she felt the fragile flutter of hope. She told herself not to be foolish. Kyle Patterson was a rancher with a massive operation to run. She was a shopkeeper stuck behind a counter 6 days a week. They had spoken for an hour, nothing more. There was no reason to think he felt anything beyond polite friendliness. But that night, lying in her narrow bed in the small apartment above the store, Delilah couldn't stop replaying their conversation in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, really looked at her, like she was someone worth seeing. She couldn't stop remembering the gentle brush of his fingers when he had handed her that coin. She fell asleep with a smile on her face for the first time in months. Kyle did return the next day, as promised. He came in the early afternoon when the store was quiet, carrying a small leather pouch that he placed on the counter. $5, he said. The dollar they owed you plus 4 more for the trouble and disrespect. I've had a talk with those boys. They won't bother you again. You really didn't have to do that, Delilah said, but she appreciated it more than she could say. Those extra $4 would go a long way. Yes, I did, Kyle said firmly. Now about those supplies. They spent another hour going over what the ranch needed, and Delilah found herself enjoying the work in a way she usually didn't. There was something satisfying about Kyle's questions, the way he really listened to her answers and took her advice seriously. He treated her like an expert, not just a shopkeeper, and that respect warmed her from the inside out. "I'll have everything ready by Friday," she said when they had finalized the order. "You can send someone to pick it up, or I can arrange delivery for an additional fee." "I'll pick it up myself," Kyle said. "Gives me a reason to come back to town." Was she imagining the way he looked at her when he said that? Delilah wasn't sure, and she was too much out of practice with these things to trust her own judgment, but her heart beat a little faster anyway. Over the next few weeks, Kyle became a regular presence in her store. He always had a reason, another supply order, a question about where to find a good blacksmith, advice on which feed supplier was most reliable. But the conversations always drifted beyond business into more personal territory. He told her about his years in Texas, about the hard men he had worked for and the lessons he had learned. She told him about growing up in Gila Bend, about her parents and the store and the strange isolation of being surrounded by people, yet somehow always alone. "How is that possible?" Kyle asked one day. They were sitting on the bench outside her store in the relative cool of early evening after she had closed up for the day. It was becoming a habit, these end-of-day conversations, and Delilah looked forward to them more than she cared to admit. "You talk to people all day long." "Talking to people isn't the same as connecting with them," Delilah said. She was holding a cup of coffee, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and amber. "Most of my customers see me as just the shopkeeper, the person who sells them what they need. They don't see me as a person with thoughts and feelings and dreams." "What are your dreams?" Kyle asked quietly. Delilah was surprised by the question. No one had asked her that in years, maybe ever. She thought about it carefully before answering. "I used to dream about traveling," she said finally. "About seeing San Francisco or New Orleans or even New York City. I wanted to see the ocean and ride a train through the mountains and eat in fancy restaurants." She laughed softly. "Silly, I know." "Not silly at all," Kyle said. "Why haven't you?" "The store," Delilah said simply. "I can't just leave it, and besides, it's too late now. Those were a young girl's dreams." "You're not old," Kyle protested. "What are you, 28, 29? 32, Delilah corrected, both pleased and embarrassed by his estimate. "That's not old," Kyle insisted. "That's just getting started on really living." He shifted on the bench to face her more directly. "Delilah, why do you talk about yourself like your life is over? You've got decades ahead of you." "Decades of what?" Delilah asked, and heard the bitterness in her own voice. "Running this store, growing old alone, watching everyone else get married and have families while I just exist. Is that what you want?" Kyle asked. "Marriage, a family." Delilah felt her throat tighten. It was the question she had stopped letting herself consider, the wanting that hurt too much to acknowledge. "It doesn't matter what I want," she said. "That ship has sailed." "Why?" Kyle pressed. "Because you're 32, that's ridiculous. Plenty of people get married later in life." "Not women like me," Delilah said. "I'm too independent, too set in my ways. I spent too many years building a life alone, and now I wouldn't know how to share it with someone else." She stood up abruptly, unable to handle the intensity of the conversation. "I should go inside. It's getting late." Kyle stood too, reaching out to gently touch her arm. "Delilah, wait. I'm sorry if I upset you. That wasn't my intention." "You didn't upset me," Delilah said, though they both knew it was a lie. "I'm just tired. It's been a long day." He let her go, but she could feel his gaze on her back as she retreated into the store and locked the door behind her. Upstairs in her apartment, she stood at the window and watched him finally mount his horse and ride off into the gathering darkness. She pressed her forehead against the glass and let herself feel the full weight of her loneliness, the ache of wanting something she was afraid to reach for. The next day was Sunday, and Delilah closed the store as usual. She attended the small church service in the morning, sitting in her customary pew and singing hymns with the rest of the sparse congregation. Afterward, she made small talk with the minister's wife and old Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house. It was all pleasant and polite and utterly hollow. She was walking back to her store when she saw Kyle riding into town. Her heart did that stupid fluttering thing again, even as her mind reminded her that she had no claim on him, that their conversations meant nothing, that she was too old and too set in her ways for romance. He saw her and changed direction, guiding his horse over to where she stood on the wooden sidewalk. "Morning," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Heading back from church?" "Yes," Delilah said, shielding her eyes from the sun to look up at him. "What brings you to town on a Sunday?" "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you," Kyle said. He dismounted and looped his horse's reins around the hitching post. "If you have some time." "I suppose I do," Delilah said cautiously. "Would you like to come up? I was about to make some lunch." She regretted the invitation the moment it left her mouth. It was too familiar, too domestic, suggesting an intimacy they didn't have. But Kyle accepted with a warm smile, and soon they were climbing the narrow stairs to her apartment above the store. It was the first time anyone besides herself had been in this space in over a year, and Delilah saw it with fresh eyes. The small sitting room with its faded furniture, the tiny kitchen with its cast iron stove, the single bedroom visible through a half-open door. It was clean but sparse, the home of someone who had stopped trying to make a life and was just going through the motions. "It's not much," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's nice," Kyle said, and he seemed to mean it. "Cozy." Delilah busied herself making coffee and assembling a simple meal of bread, cheese, and some cold chicken left over from the day before. Kyle sat at her small table and watched her move around the kitchen with an attention that made her intensely aware of every gesture. "I wanted to apologize for last night," he said when she set the food on the table and sat down across from him. "I pushed too hard with personal questions. That wasn't my place." "You don't need to apologize," Delilah said. "I was just being oversensitive." "No, you weren't," Kyle said. He picked up a piece of bread but didn't eat it, just turned it over in his hands. "Delilah, can I be honest with you about something?" Her heart started pounding. "Of course." "I didn't inherit the Patterson ranch expecting to stay," Kyle said. "When I got the letter from the lawyer telling me about Marcus, I figured I'd come out here, sell the place, and go back to Texas with enough money to maybe buy a small spread of my own." He finally looked up at her, and his dark eyes were intense. "But then I got here, and I realized this could be something more. The ranch is bigger and better than anything I could have afforded on my own. It's a real opportunity to build something lasting." "That sounds like a good thing," Delilah said carefully, not sure where he was going with this. "It is," Kyle agreed, "but it's also lonely. I spend my days working from sunup to sundown, managing cattle and horses and ranch hands, fixing everything my uncle let slide in his last years. And at night, I sit in that big empty house and eat meals by myself and wonder what the point of it all is." He set the bread down and reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "And then I come to town and I see you, and suddenly everything makes sense again." Delilah's breath caught. "Kyle." "I'm not saying this right," Kyle said, tightening his grip on her hand. "I'm better with cattle than I am with words. But what I'm trying to say is that I have feelings for you, Delilah, strong feelings. And I think maybe you feel something too, but you've convinced yourself you shouldn't or can't, and I want to know why." Delilah felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to pull her hand away, to retreat into the safety of her carefully constructed emotional walls, but she also wanted to be brave enough to tell him the truth. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm terrified, actually." "Of what?" Kyle asked gently. "Of wanting something I can't have," Delilah said. "Of hoping and then being disappointed. Of letting myself care about someone and then losing them like I lost everyone else I ever loved." The tears spilled over now, running down her cheeks. "I've spent years teaching myself not to want things, Kyle. It was the only way to survive. And now you're here, and you're making me want things again, and it scares me half to death." Kyle stood up and moved around the table, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. He took both her hands in his and held them against his chest. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I've never wanted to build a life with someone before. But I want that with you, Delilah. I want to come home to you at the end of the day. I want to hear about your customers and your orders and whatever else you want to tell me. I want to take you to see the ocean and ride that train through the mountains. I want to give you those dreams you think are too late." "We barely know each other," Delilah protested weakly. "Then let's get to know each other," Kyle said. "Let me court you properly. Let me take you to dinner, to church socials, on rides through the desert. Let me prove to you that it's not too late, that love hasn't passed you by." He reached up and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. "Please, Delilah, give us a chance." Delilah looked into his earnest face and felt the last of her resistance crumble. She was tired of being afraid, tired of being alone, tired of pretending she didn't want exactly what he was offering. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'll give us a chance." Kyle's face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen on him. He stood up, pulling her to her feet, and before she could think about what was happening, he had wrapped her in his arms and was holding her close. Delilah stiffened for just a moment, unused to such physical affection, and then melted into the embrace. He was solid and warm and real, and she could feel his heart beating against her cheek. "Thank you," he murmured into her hair. "You won't regret this, I promise." And standing there in her tiny apartment with this man she had known for only a few weeks, Delilah believed him. For the first time in years, she let herself believe that happiness might actually be possible. Their courtship began tentatively, but grew stronger with each passing day. Kyle started coming to town more often, always with a reason but really just to see her. He would help her move heavy boxes in the store, fix a squeaky door hinge, or just sit on that bench outside and talk with her during her quiet moments. The townspeople noticed, of course, and gossip spread like wildfire through Gila Bend. But for once, Delilah didn't care what people thought. She was too happy to care about anything except the growing warmth in her chest whenever Kyle was near. Their first official outing was to a church social 2 weeks after that conversation in her apartment. Kyle arrived at her store just as she was closing up, looking uncomfortable in a clean pressed shirt and string tie. "I feel like a trussed turkey," he muttered, tugging at the collar. Delilah laughed and reached up to straighten his tie. "You look very handsome," she said, and was rewarded by the slight blush that colored his cheeks. "Not as beautiful as you," Kyle said, looking at her with such open admiration that Delilah felt her own cheeks warm. She had worn her best dress, a deep green that brought out her eyes, and had taken extra care with her hair, leaving a few curls loose around her face. It felt strange to make such an effort, to care about how she looked for someone else, but it also felt wonderful. The social was being held in the churchyard, with tables set up under the stars and lanterns hanging from posts to provide light. It seemed like half the town was there, and Delilah felt every eye turn toward them as they arrived. She heard the whispers, saw the knowing looks. Old Mrs. Henderson gave her an approving nod. The minister's wife smiled warmly. Even crusty old Samuel Morrison raised his cup in a silent toast. "Everyone is staring," Delilah murmured as Kyle guided her toward an empty spot at one of the tables. "Let them stare," Kyle said easily. "I'm proud to be seen with you." They ate fried chicken and potato salad and fresh biscuits with butter. They talked and laughed with their neighbors, and when someone produced a fiddle and people began to dance, Kyle stood and offered his hand. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer," he said. "Neither am I," Delilah admitted, but she took his hand anyway. He led her to the improvised dance floor, and she discovered he was right about not being much of a dancer. He was stiff and awkward, stepping on her toes twice in the first minute. But he was also trying so hard, his face scrunched in concentration, that Delilah couldn't help but find it endearing. "I'm sorry," he said after the second misstep. "I warned you." "It's fine," Delilah said, laughing. "Just relax and feel the music." "Easy for you to say," Kyle grumbled, but he did try to relax. Gradually, they found a rhythm, nothing fancy but functional. And as they moved together under the stars, Delilah realized she was having more fun than she had had in years. She felt young again, carefree, like maybe 32 wasn't too old for new beginnings after all. "What are you thinking about?" Kyle asked, noticing her smile. "Just that I'm happy," Delilah said honestly. "Really happy." Kyle pulled her a little closer, not enough to be scandalous, but enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "Good," he said. "That's all I want, to make you happy." As summer turned to fall, their relationship deepened. Kyle took her riding through the desert on Sunday afternoons, showing her parts of the territory she had never seen despite living there her whole life. They packed picnics and found shaded spots near the river where they could sit and talk for hours. He told her about his childhood, about the mother he barely remembered and the hard men who had raised him after she died. She told him about her fears and dreams, about the loneliness she had carried for so long. One evening in late September, Kyle took her to his ranch for the first time. Delilah had been nervous about it, worried about what it would mean to see his home, to be invited into that intimate space. But the moment they rode through the gates, and she saw the sprawling house with its wide porch and the barn and corrals spreading out behind it, she felt something settle inside her. This was where Kyle belonged, and she could picture herself belonging here too. "It needs work," Kyle said as he helped her down from her horse. "The house hasn't seen a woman's touch in years, but it's solid. Good bones." "It's wonderful," Delilah said, and meant it. The house was much larger than she had expected, built of adobe and wood with a red tile roof. It did look a bit shabby, with peeling paint and sagging shutters, but she could see the potential beneath the neglect. Kyle gave her a tour, pointing out the repairs he had already made and the ones still needed. The inside was sparsely furnished, with heavy masculine furniture that had probably been there since Marcus Patterson first built the place. But the rooms were spacious and filled with light, and Delilah found herself mentally redecorating, imagining curtains on the windows and rugs on the floors. "What do you think?" Kyle asked when they ended up back in the kitchen, a large room with a massive stone fireplace and a scarred wooden table. "I think it's a house waiting to become a home," Delilah said carefully. Kyle stepped closer, his expression serious. "I keep imagining you here," he said. "Working in this kitchen, sitting on that porch, sleeping in the bedroom upstairs. Is that crazy?" "No," Delilah said, her heart racing. "I've been imagining it too." He cupped her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "I love you, Delilah," he said, and the words fell into the quiet kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread through her entire being. I know it's fast and maybe you're not ready to hear it, but I can't keep it in anymore. I love you. Delilah felt her eyes fill with tears for the second time since knowing him, but these were different tears, joyful ones. I love you too, she whispered. I've been fighting it because I was afraid, but I do. I love you so much it terrifies me. Kyle kissed her then, a gentle, tentative kiss that quickly deepened into something more. Delilah wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring years of loneliness and longing into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and Kyle pressed his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know we've only known each other a few months, but I don't want to wait. I don't want to spend another day without you." "Yes," Delilah said without hesitation. She had spent too many years being cautious, playing it safe, protecting herself from hurt. But Kyle had shown her that love was worth the risk. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married in early November of 1883 in the same small church where Delilah had attended services her entire life. It was a modest ceremony, nothing fancy, with just the townspeople in attendance and the minister's wife playing the organ. Delilah wore a new dress of pale blue silk that Kyle had ordered special from San Francisco, refusing to tell her how much it cost. Kyle wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and uncomfortable, tugging at his collar throughout the ceremony. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Kyle he could kiss his bride, Delilah felt like her heart might burst from happiness. This was what she had given up hoping for, what she had convinced herself she didn't need. And now it was hers. The reception was held at the church, with food and dancing and well wishes from their neighbors. Old Mrs. Henderson cried and said she knew they were meant for each other from the start. Samuel Morrison gave Kyle a stern warning about treating her right. Even the minister's wife hugged Delilah and whispered that it was never too late for love. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Kyle and Delilah climbed into his wagon for the ride out to the ranch. Delilah had closed her store for the week, arranging with a neighbor to check on things while she was gone. It felt strange to leave it, the business that had been her entire life for so long, but also liberating. She was starting a new chapter, and for the first time in years, she was excited about what came next. The ranch house looked different as they approached in the gathering darkness. Kyle had strung lanterns along the porch, creating a warm, welcoming glow. Inside, she found that he had cleaned everything thoroughly and stocked the kitchen with supplies from her own store. There was even a vase of wildflowers on the table, clearly picked that morning. "You did all this?" Delilah asked, touched by the effort. "I wanted you to feel welcome," Kyle said. "This is your home now, too." That night, in the big bedroom upstairs, Kyle made love to his wife with a tenderness that made Delilah cry again. She had been nervous, uncertain, very aware that at 32 she was coming to her marriage bed far less experienced than most brides. But Kyle was patient and gentle, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. And when it was over and they lay tangled together in the darkness, Delilah felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible. "I used to think I was fine on my own," she whispered into the quiet. "I convinced myself that I didn't need anyone else." "And now?" Kyle asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Now I know I was just surviving," Delilah said, "but with you, I'm actually living." The first months of their marriage were an adjustment. Delilah had to learn to balance her responsibilities at the store with her new role as a ranch wife. She kept the store open 3 days a week, hiring a young man named Tommy to help with the heavy work and to mind things when she couldn't be there. The other days, she spent at the ranch, learning about the operation and slowly making the house into a home. It wasn't always easy. Kyle worked long, hard hours, often leaving before dawn and not returning until after dark. There were times when Delilah felt lonely, rattling around in the big house by herself. But then Kyle would come home, dusty and exhausted, and his face would light up when he saw her, and all the loneliness would vanish. They settled into a rhythm. Delilah would have dinner waiting when Kyle came in, and they would sit at the kitchen table and talk about their days. She told him about customers and orders, about the funny things Tommy said, and the gossip she heard. He told her about the cattle and horses, about problems with fences or water or difficult ranch hands. It was comfortable and domestic and everything Delilah had secretly wanted. Winter came to the Arizona desert, bringing cold nights and occasional rain. Kyle taught Delilah to ride better, taking her out to check on the herds and see the ranch operation up close. She learned to tell a healthy cow from a sick one, to spot problems with fences or water troughs. She met all the ranch hands and learned their names and stories. Some were the rough types she expected, but most were just hard-working men trying to make a living. The three who had caused trouble in her store that first day were no longer working at the ranch. Kyle had fired them within a week of taking over, telling Delilah that he wouldn't employ men who disrespected women. She had protested that it wasn't necessary, but secretly, she was glad. She didn't want to see them every day, didn't want that reminder of her former helplessness. For Christmas, Kyle surprised her with a trip to Tucson, the largest town in the territory. They stayed in a real hotel and ate in restaurants and went to a theater performance. It was the first time Delilah had left Gila Bend in over 5 years, and she felt like a child again, amazed by everything. Kyle watched her with indulgent amusement, clearly delighted by her delight. "We should do this more often," he said as they walked back to their hotel after the show. "Travel, I mean, see some of those places you dreamed about." "Maybe someday," Delilah said, linking her arm through his. "But honestly, I don't need to see the world. I'm happy right where I am." "With me?" Kyle asked, smiling. "With you," Delilah confirmed. "You're all the adventure I need." By spring of 1884, Delilah had fully moved into her new life. She sold her apartment above the store to Tommy, who had proven himself reliable and trustworthy. She kept ownership of the store itself, but Tommy managed it day to day, with Delilah coming in a couple of times a week to handle the books and orders. It was a good arrangement that gave her more time at the ranch while still maintaining her independence. The ranch was thriving under Kyle's management. He had fixed the problems Marcus had let slide, upgraded the herds, and built a reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock. Money was coming in steadily, and Kyle started talking about expanding, maybe buying more land or investing in better breeding stock. But more than the financial success, Delilah saw the change in Kyle himself. He was happier, more settled, like he had finally found where he belonged. He laughed more easily, smiled more often, and when he looked at her, his eyes held a depth of love and contentment that made her breath catch. One evening in late April, Delilah realized her monthly courses were late. At first, she dismissed it as stress or the change in her routine. But as days turned into weeks and other symptoms appeared, she had to face the possibility that she might be pregnant. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. At 33, she was aware that pregnancy carried more risks than it would have 10 years earlier. But she also desperately wanted a child, wanted to create a family with Kyle, wanted to see his features reflected in a baby's face. She waited until she was sure before telling him. It was a Sunday evening, and they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the desert. Kyle had his arm around her shoulders and she was leaning against him, feeling safe and cherished. "I have something to tell you," she said quietly. "What's that?" Kyle asked, his tone easy and relaxed. I'm pregnant, Delilah said. We're going to have a baby. Kyle went completely still. Then he pulled back to look at her face, his expression a mixture of shock and wonder. Are you sure? Pretty sure, Delilah said. I'll need to see the doctor to confirm, but all the signs are there. A baby, Kyle repeated, like he was testing the word. Then a huge grin spread across his face, and he let out a whoop that probably carried all the way to the bunkhouse. He picked Delilah up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. We're going to have a baby. Put me down, you crazy man, Delilah said, laughing too. You'll make me dizzy. Kyle set her down carefully, immediately solicitous. Are you okay? Do you feel all right? Should you be sitting down? I'm fine, Delilah assured him. Pregnant women don't need to be treated like invalids, but Kyle was having none of it. From that moment on, he treated Delilah like she was made of spun glass. He insisted she stop going into the store entirely, wouldn't let her lift anything heavier than a coffee pot, and hovered over her constantly. It was simultaneously annoying and endearing. The pregnancy progressed normally through the summer and into the fall. Delilah's belly swelled, and she felt the baby moving inside her, a strange, fluttering sensation that became stronger as the months passed. Kyle would put his hand on her stomach and marvel at every kick, his eyes filling with wonder. He's going to be strong, Kyle would say. Or she, Delilah would correct. It might be a girl. Either way, Kyle would say, as long as you're both healthy. The baby came on a cold December night, 3 weeks before Christmas. Delilah's labor started in the afternoon, mild contractions that gradually grew stronger. By evening, it was clear the baby was coming. Kyle sent one of the ranch hands racing to town to fetch the doctor and the midwife, while he stayed with Delilah, holding her hand and looking terrified. This is normal, Delilah gasped between contractions. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Not my woman, Kyle said, his face pale. Not my baby. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the early morning. The doctor arrived around midnight and the midwife a few minutes later. They took over with practiced efficiency, and Kyle was relegated to pacing in the hallway outside the bedroom, wearing a path in the floorboards. Finally, as dawn was breaking over the desert, the thin wail of a newborn filled the house. Kyle burst through the door to find the midwife holding a squirming bundle wrapped in a blanket. You have a son, she said, beaming. A big, healthy boy. Kyle barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on Delilah, who looked exhausted but radiant, propped up against the pillows. Are you all right? He asked, rushing to her side. I'm perfect, Delilah said, her voice hoarse from hours of effort. Come meet your son. The midwife placed the baby in Kyle's arms, and Delilah watched her husband's face transform. He looked down at the tiny red-faced infant and tears started streaming down his cheeks. He's so small, Kyle whispered. He's nearly 9 pounds, the midwife said dryly. That's not small. They named him Marcus after Kyle's uncle, with the middle name Thomas after Delilah's father. Little Marcus Patterson was a colicky baby who cried often and slept rarely, but neither of his parents cared. They took turns walking the floor with him at night, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes, arguing good-naturedly about whether he had Kyle's nose or Delilah's eyes. The ranch house that had seemed so empty when Delilah first saw, it was now filled with baby sounds and the trappings of infant care. Diapers hung on lines to dry, bottles cluttered the kitchen counter, and Marcus's cradle sat in the corner of their bedroom where Delilah could reach it easily for night feedings. It was exhausting and wonderful, and Delilah had never been happier. She would stand in the doorway sometimes, watching Kyle hold their son and sing off key lullabies, and feel so full of love she thought she might burst. "I can't believe I almost missed this," she said one evening when Marcus was about 3 months old. They were in the kitchen and Kyle was rocking the baby while Delilah fixed dinner. "Missed what?" Kyle asked, not taking his eyes off his son. "All of it," Delilah said. "Love, marriage, motherhood. I had convinced myself I didn't need any of it, that I was fine alone." Kyle looked up at her then, his expression soft. "I'm glad you changed your mind." "I didn't change my mind," Delilah corrected. "You changed it for me. You showed me that it wasn't too late, that love hadn't passed me by. You proved it was just beginning." Kyle stood up, cradling Marcus against his shoulder, and crossed to where Delilah stood. He kissed her forehead, then her lips. "We were both beginning," he said. "I was just as lost as you were before we found each other." The years flowed by like the Gila River, steady and sure. Marcus grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. He was a curious child, always getting into things, exploring every corner of the ranch. Kyle taught him to ride before he could barely walk, putting him on a gentle old mare and leading them around the corral. When Marcus was 2.5, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, maybe because she knew what to expect. Their second child was born in the spring of 1888, a daughter they named Sarah after Kyle's mother. She was a quieter baby than Marcus had been, with a disposition as sunny as the Arizona sky. The store in town continued to operate successfully under Tommy's management, providing a steady income in addition to the ranch profits. Delilah went into town once a week to check on things, often bringing the children with her. The townspeople who had watched her spend years alone behind that counter now saw her as a wife and mother, and she could see the genuine happiness in their faces. "I always hoped you'd find someone, Mrs. Henderson told her one day, tickling Sarah under the chin. "You deserved happiness." "I didn't think I did," Delilah admitted. "I thought I had missed my chance." "There's no such thing as missing your chance at love," Mrs. Henderson said wisely. "Love comes when it comes, whether you're 18 or 80. Kyle proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband. He made time for his children despite the demands of the ranch, taking Marcus with him on rides around the property and rocking Sarah to sleep every evening. He read to them, played with them, disciplined them when necessary, but always with patience and love. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Kyle surprised Delilah with a trip to San Francisco. They left the children with Mrs. Henderson and took the train west, arriving in the city by the bay after several days of travel. It was everything Delilah had dreamed of and more: the ocean stretching to the horizon, the cable cars climbing steep hills, the restaurants and theaters and shops. They spent a week there, acting like newlyweds even though they had been married 5 years and had 2 children. They held hands while walking along the waterfront, kissed in the shadows of alleys, made love in their hotel room with a freedom they rarely had at home. It was a reminder that underneath the roles of mother and father, rancher and shopkeeper, they were still Kyle and Delilah, 2 people who had found each other against all odds. "Thank you," Delilah said on their last evening in the city. They were sitting in a nice restaurant, sharing a bottle of wine and a meal that was far fancier than anything she could make at home. "For what?" Kyle asked. "For giving me this," Delilah gestured around them. "For giving me everything. For being exactly what I needed even when I didn't know I needed it." Kyle reached across the table and took her hand. "You did the same for me," he said. "I was just drifting before I met you, working for other people, never putting down roots. You gave me a reason to stay, to build something lasting." "We built it together," Delilah said. "Yes," Kyle agreed. "Together. That's how it should be." When they returned to Gila Bend, they found their children happy and healthy and thrilled to see them. Marcus, now 5, had stories about helping with the horses, while 3-year-old Sarah had picked wildflowers that were now wilted in a jar. They spent that evening on the porch, the 4 of them, and Delilah felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. More years passed. Marcus started school in town, riding in with Delilah when she went to check on the store. Sarah followed 2 years later, and the house felt empty during the day without their chatter and laughter. But it filled up again in the evenings, with homework and dinner and the routine chaos of family life. The ranch continued to prosper. Kyle expanded the operation carefully, buying adjacent land when it became available, upgrading the breeding stock, building a reputation that extended far beyond Gila Bend. He was respected as a fair boss and a shrewd businessman, and men came from as far as Tucson to buy his cattle and horses. But success didn't change him. He still got up before dawn to check on the herds, still worked alongside his ranch hands, still came home dusty and tired and ready to spend time with his family. He never took his good fortune for granted, never forgot what it felt like to be a hired hand with nothing to call his own. Delilah divided her time between the ranch and the store, between motherhood and business ownership, and found fulfillment in both roles. She had good help at the store and efficient household help at the ranch, allowing her to focus on what was most important to her family. When Marcus turned 12, he started working seriously on the ranch, learning the business from his father. He had Kyle's natural way with animals and Delilah's head for figures, a combination that promised he would be good at running the operation someday. Sarah, at 10, showed more interest in the store, often accompanying Delilah to town and helping with inventory and customers. "They're growing up so fast," Delilah said one evening. She and Kyle were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset like they had done so many times over the years. The children were inside doing homework. "Too fast," Kyle agreed. "Seems like just yesterday they were babies." "Do you ever regret it?" Delilah asked. "Taking a chance on a woman you barely knew?" Kyle turned to look at her, his expression incredulous. "Regret? Delilah, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Marrying you was the smartest decision I ever made." "Even though I was convinced love had passed me by," Delilah teased. "Especially because of that," Kyle said. "It meant you weren't just looking for anyone. You had to be sure. And once you decided, you gave me everything: your love, your trust, your faith in our future together." "You made it easy," Delilah said. "You showed me that it was just beginning, all of it. The love, the life, the happiness. I thought my story was over, but you helped me see I was just starting a new chapter." Kyle pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat like that as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared, comfortable in each other's presence, content with the life they had built. As the years continued to roll forward, life maintained its steady rhythm. There were challenges, of course. A particularly harsh winter in 1895 killed some cattle, and a drought the following summer tested their water resources. Marcus broke his arm falling from a horse when he was 14, and Sarah came down with a fever that had Delilah pacing the floors for 3 terrifying nights. But they weathered every storm together. Kyle and Delilah united in their commitment to each other and their family. The love that had bloomed between them that first year only deepened over time, growing roots that anchored them through whatever difficulties came their way. In the spring of 1898, Marcus turned 18 and officially became a full partner in the ranch operation. He was a good-looking young man now, tall like his father with his mother's coloring, and Delilah could see girls in town watching him with interest. But Marcus was focused on the ranch, on learning everything he could from Kyle, on proving himself worthy of the legacy being passed to him. Sarah, at 16, announced her intention to buy out Tommy's share of the store and take over management herself. She had been working there most afternoons and weekends for years, and she knew the business inside and out. Delilah was surprised but delighted, seeing her daughter's entrepreneurial spirit as a reflection of her own. "Are you sure?" she asked. "It's a big responsibility." "I'm sure," Sarah said firmly. "You started running it when you were younger than I am now. I'm ready." So the arrangements were made. Tommy, now in his mid-30s and courting a widow with 3 children, was happy to sell his share and move on to the next phase of his life. Sarah moved into the apartment above the store and threw herself into the business with an energy and innovation that reminded Delilah of her own younger self. With both children launched into their adult lives, Delilah and Kyle found themselves in a new phase of their marriage. The house was quieter, the days less hectic. They had time for each other again, time to rediscover the couple they had been before children and responsibility consumed their attention. "It's strange, isn't it?" Delilah said one evening. They were in bed, and she was curled against Kyle's side, his arm around her shoulders. "The house being so quiet. Different," Kyle agreed, "but not bad. I kind of like having you to myself again." Delilah smiled against his chest. They were both in their late 40s now, Kyle's dark hair showing threads of silver, lines deepening around Delilah's eyes and mouth. But when she looked at him, she still saw the man who had stood up for her in her store all those years ago, who had looked at her like she was someone worth fighting for. "You remember the day we met?" she asked. "Every detail," Kyle said. "You were behind that counter, trying to stand up to those troublemakers, and I thought you were the bravest, most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." "I wasn't brave," Delilah protested. "I was terrified." "You were brave," Kyle insisted. "You've always been brave, even when you didn't believe it yourself." He shifted so he could look down at her. "You had the courage to let me in, to trust me with your heart. That took real bravery." "You made it worth it," Delilah said. "Every risk, every moment of fear, you made it all worthwhile." They made love that night with the slow tenderness of long familiarity, knowing each other's bodies and preferences perfectly after so many years together. And afterward, holding each other in the darkness, Delilah felt the same contentment she had felt that first night as husband and wife, the same sense of rightness and completion. The new century arrived with celebrations throughout Arizona territory. Gila Bend marked the occasion with a party in the town square, and both the Patterson and Gregory families were there. Marcus brought a young woman named Emily that he had been courting, and Sarah came with a rancher's son she had met through the store. Kyle and Delilah stood together, watching their children and feeling the weight of years and blessings. "A new century," Kyle mused. "Who would have thought we'd see it?" "I'm glad we're seeing it together," Delilah said. Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, and by then the Pattersons were one of the most respected families in the region. Marcus had married Emily and given Kyle and Delilah 2 grandchildren, both boys who loved coming to the ranch and following their grandfather around. Sarah had married her rancher's son and was running not just the store in Gila Bend, but also 2 others in nearby towns. The Patterson Ranch covered thousands of acres and employed dozens of men. But more than the material success, Kyle and Delilah had built a legacy of love. Their marriage stood as proof that it was never too late for happiness, that love could bloom even in the harsh desert soil if you had the courage to nurture it. As they grew older, Kyle's hair turned fully silver, and he moved a bit slower after a lifetime of hard ranch work. Delilah's auburn hair faded to a softer shade threaded with white, and her hands showed the effects of years of labor. But they still walked together in the evenings, still sat on that porch and watched the sunset, still held each other at night like they had from the beginning. On their 30th wedding anniversary in November of 1913, their children threw them a party at the ranch. It seemed like half of Arizona showed up, friends and neighbors and business associates, all coming to celebrate a marriage that had become legendary in the region. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and reminiscing, but the moment Delilah treasured most came late in the evening when most of the guests had left. She and Kyle stood on the porch, much as they had so many times before, looking out at the land they had built their life on. 30 years, Kyle said wonderingly. Where did the time go? It went into this, Delilah said, gesturing at the ranch, at the lights still glowing in the windows where their grandchildren were being put to bed, at the life spread out before them. It went into building something real and lasting. Do you ever think about that day we met? Kyle asked. When you were convinced love had passed you by. Sometimes, Delilah admitted. And I'm so grateful I was wrong, or rather that you proved I was wrong. Kyle turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Even at 63, his eyes still held that same intensity they had when he first walked into her store. You weren't wrong, he said. Love had passed you by, all the wrong loves, all the ones that wouldn't have made you happy. It just took a while for the right love to find you. And it did, Delilah said, tears gathering in her eyes. Happy tears, grateful tears. It found me in you. We found each other, Kyle corrected. He leaned down and kissed her, and it was like coming home, like every kiss over 30 years had led to this moment. And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. They continued to live on the ranch for many more years, gradually turning over more responsibility to Marcus, but staying involved in the operation. They became the matriarch and patriarch of a growing family, with grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren filling the house with noise and life. Delilah kept an eye on the stores through Sarah, offering advice when asked, but trusting her daughter's judgment. She watched with pride as Sarah expanded the business and made her own mark, just as she had watched Marcus make the ranch even more successful than Kyle had. But more than business success or financial prosperity, what Delilah valued most was the love that surrounded her. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every quiet evening with Kyle, these were the moments that made her life rich and full. Kyle passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1925, at the age of 75. He simply didn't wake up one morning, and Delilah found him looking peaceful and young, like he was having a pleasant dream. She sat with him for a long time before calling anyone, holding his hand and saying goodbye to the man who had changed her life so completely. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, testament to the impact Kyle had made during his years in Arizona. But it was the private moments Delilah treasured, the memories that sustained her through the grief. She remembered that first day in her store, his quiet strength standing up for her. She remembered their wedding, his tears when Marcus was born, his laughter echoing through the house. She remembered 34 years of love, and she knew she had been blessed beyond measure. Delilah lived another 6 years after Kyle's death, staying on the ranch that had become her home. She remained active and engaged, spending time with her children and grandchildren, keeping up with the businesses, and sitting on that porch every evening to watch the sunset. People often commented on how well she was doing, how strong she was, but Delilah knew the truth. She carried Kyle with her always, in her heart and in the life they had built together. On a warm November evening in 1931, Delilah called her family together. She was 80 years old now, and she had been feeling increasingly tired, sensing her time was drawing to a close. Marcus and Sarah came with their families, filling the ranch house with the people she loved most. "I want to tell you all something," Delilah said as they gathered in the living room. Her voice was weaker than it used to be, but it still carried conviction. When I was 32 years old, I believed my life was over. I thought love had passed me by, that I would spend the rest of my days alone behind that store counter, watching life happen to other people. I had given up hope. She looked around at her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, seeing Kyle's features reflected in their faces. And then your grandfather walked into my store and showed me I was wrong. He showed me that it wasn't too late, that love hadn't passed me by at all. He showed me it was just beginning. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. Everything I have, everything we've built as a family, it all started with his courage and his love. He saw something in me I couldn't see in myself. He believed in us when I was too afraid to believe. Marcus came and knelt beside her chair, taking her hand. "He loved you so much, Mama." "I know," Delilah said, "and I loved him. I still love him. That kind of love doesn't end just because someone is gone." She squeezed Marcus's hand. "I want you all to remember that. Remember that it's never too late for love, never too late for happiness. Don't give up hope. Don't settle for less than what your heart truly wants. Your grandfather taught me that, and it's the most valuable lesson I ever learned." Sarah was crying now, and so were several of the grandchildren. But they were all listening, absorbing this final piece of wisdom from the woman who had built so much from so little. Delilah passed away peacefully a few days later, sitting in her chair on the porch, watching the sun set over the desert one final time. They buried her next to Kyle, in the small cemetery outside Gila Bend, beneath a sky so vast and blue, it seemed to go on forever. The ranch and the stores continued to thrive under the next generation's management, and the Patterson name remained respected throughout Arizona. But more important than business success was the legacy of love that Delilah and Kyle had created. Their story became family legend, passed down to children and grandchildren, a reminder that love could bloom at any age, that it was never too late to find happiness. In the years that followed, whenever someone in the family faced heartbreak or loneliness or despair, they would remember Delilah's story. They would remember how she had convinced herself love had passed her by at 32, how she had resigned herself to a life alone. And they would remember how Kyle had walked into her store that day and proven her wrong, showing her that love wasn't ending, it was just beginning. The town of Gila Bend changed over the decades, growing and modernizing, but the old general store remained, now operated by a fourth generation of the family. Visitors sometimes stopped in and asked about the portraits hanging on the wall, a stern-faced young woman and a weather-beaten cowboy, and they would hear the story of how two lonely people found each other in the harsh Arizona desert and built a love that lasted lifetimes. It was a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes the best things come to those who have the courage to hope again, to trust again, to believe that even when you think your story is over, it might just be beginning. Delilah had thought her chance at love was gone, but Kyle showed her the truth that love has no timeline, no expiration date, no age limit. It simply waits for the right moment, the right person, the right spark to bring it to life. And once it comes, if you're brave enough to embrace it, it can transform everything. It can turn a lonely shopkeeper into a beloved wife and mother. It can turn a wandering cowboy into a pillar of the community. It can fill an empty house with laughter and an empty heart with joy. That was the legacy Delilah and Kyle left behind, not just land and businesses and descendants, but the enduring proof that love, real love, is always worth waiting for. And when it finally arrives, whether you're 18 or 80, you'll know it was worth every moment of loneliness, every year of waiting, every disappointment that came before, because true love doesn't pass you by. It finds you exactly when you need it most, exactly when you're ready to receive it, exactly when you can appreciate what a precious gift it truly is. And once you have it, once you've found that person who makes your world make sense, you hold on tight and never let go. That's what Delilah and Kyle did. They held on to each other through good times and bad, through challenges and triumphs, through the ordinary days and the extraordinary moments. They built a life together, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one act of love at a time. And in the end, when their story was complete and their lives had run their course, they left behind something far more valuable than wealth or property. They left behind the knowledge that love endures, that hope matters, that it's never too late to start again. They left behind proof that a cowboy really could prove to a skeptical woman that her love story wasn't ending, it was just beginning.